Between 1984 and 1990, you could purchase this Quad 34 preamplifier for $600 or about $1,700 in February 2024 dollars. It had a frequency response of 30 hertz to 20 kilohertz plus or minus 0.3 of a dB at not more than 0.05% THD. I'm going to talk about some of its features, and this particular unit came to me with a problem in that one of the channels had no sound coming out, and I'll get into what I found about that. And I'll do the typical tour, as I call it. We'll take a look at the front and the back, and then I'll take the cover off and you can see what it looks like inside. And then there'll be test data, and I'll tell you what I thought after using this cute little guy. Now, I should point out it only weighs about 7 pounds. It's pretty darn small, and you know, it does have this kind of cute little look to it, but it is from Britain or England. I don't know which they prefer, but it does have those stupid DIN jacks. I'm not a fan of DIN jacks for the inputs and outputs. The disc input is RCA, but by disc they mean phono. That's probably another English thing, but the phono input is a standard RCA type input, and then there's a ground lug for your turntable ground to connect to. So we'll get into the little tour, then the data, and I'll tell you what I thought after using it. Here is a close-up view of the Quad 34. Starting over here, we have our on-off push-button switch. Volume control is here. Balance control is here. This tilt control is our treble control, and this bass lift is our bass control. We have a mono switch here. We have 2 filters here, and if I press the SL, it increases the effect of each of the filters, and I believe if you press this a second time, it increases the effect more, and I will show you the response of these filters without the SL being pressed. We have our radio input here. This disc is the phono input, and auxiliary input, and a tape input. Obviously, this is the rear of the Quad 34. This guy right here is our phono grounding jack. Our phono inputs are right here, the only RCA inputs. It's labeled disc, but that means phono disc. Here are our tape monitor jacks right here, auxiliary, radio, and then our output jacks. And of course, these are my favorite jacks. They're DIN. These are 5-pin DIN, and this guy is different than that. We obviously have the ability to change for our country's voltage right here. User replaceable fuses here, and then we have a switched AC outlet jack here and our IEC AC input jack. Here is what the Q34 looks like with the cover removed. Inside of here are our power supply components, and this kind of just shows you the build quality and the fact that they have these switches, or actually they're pots, but they're like printed resistor pots rather than a standard potentiometer pot. Here is a view taken from the other direction, just to kind of see what else is going on that you couldn't see from the other direction. So this view shows you all the solder joints that are on this guy, except for the ones that are hidden under this plastic shield here for the power supply. And what's really nice is that you can see where all the components are, and it makes it really easy to troubleshoot the unit and work on it from a service point of view. Now, the problem with this unit happened to be in here. I don't know what had happened before, but somebody had cut some jumpers or traces, and so the output wasn't even connected for the one channel. So I don't know why they did what they did, but I had to track down the connections to make sure that they were going to the proper point on the DIN jack. Here's our standard, or almost standard, THD SNR plot. at 1 kilohertz. In this case, I have the signal applied to the radio input rather than the aux input, because if I turn the power off, it always defaults to the radio input. And what I've done here is I've set the gain up as high as I could go before I start getting a lot of distortion. And that is, we'll call it minus 4 dB or maybe minus 4.8 dB, which is actually a loss. That is because if I go any higher than that with the volume control, it's going to start distorting, and I'll show you that in a minute. But also, the max output for this guy is 0.5 volt, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. We're seeing a little bit over 0.5 volt out. You can see our THD looks really good. It's better than 0.008%, and the specification is that it should be less than 0.05% from 30 hertz to 10 kilohertz. Also, our SNRs aren't horrible. They're about 76 dB. They're matching pretty well, and the THD plus noise is minus 74 dB, so that looks pretty good. So what I am going to do is increase the gain just a little bit, and we'll see how that distortion gets really bad. And so right now, the gain control or volume control is set at 14. And let me increase it to 15. That's 15. And you can see at 15, it starts looking really, really bad as far as distortion is concerned. So go back it down a bit. Right now we're looking at the frequency response of the Quad 34 with a signal applied to the radio input. In this case, you could use radio or auxiliary, and I'm using the radio input. And it has a 0 dBV signal applied. Now, the specification that I found for frequency response was plus or minus 0.3 dB from 30 hertz to 20 kilohertz. The 30 hertz would be at this point right here. So we're meeting that requirement. And at 20 kilohertz, we're also looking pretty good. So it's got a flatness of maybe a little over 0.2 dB in this area here, but for the most part, the frequency response looks really good. I have backed down the volume control just a little bit so we could look at the harmonics. And what's interesting is that the second or even harmonic is just a little bit higher than the odd or third harmonic. This plot shows the Quad 34's THD versus frequency for a couple different input signal levels. 0 would be 0 dBV and minus 15 would be minus 15 dBV applied to the radio input. And you can see that at worst case, it's maybe 0.1% THD. The specification was that it should be 0.05, which would be somewhere right in here. So it is better than that throughout most of the band, and also it would start at 30 hertz, which would be here. So it was actually specified that the distortion between 30 hertz and 10 kilohertz, which should be here, should be better than 0.05% THD, and it's almost meeting that requirement. Here is the Quad 34's multitone response, and the volume control was set to give the minimum amount of distortion with a 0 dBV signal applied, which yields in about 4.5 dB of gain. And we've got a minus 12 dBV multi-signal going in, and this yields a distortion-free range of about 15 to 16 bits. Here is a plot showing the left to right and right to left crosstalk for the Quad 34, and this is with a minus 3 dBV signal applied to the active channel. And there is a specification that it should be better than 50 dB, which it is. Our crosstalk is varying anywhere from, say, 90 dB down to 60 dB, let's say. So overall, it is meeting its crosstalk requirement. Here is the system noise plot for the Quad 34. In this case, the radio input is selected, and those inputs are terminated into shorts. And we're just looking at the noise of the system with the volume control set to give us the maximum gain, which is about a minus 4 dB gain, or more of a loss than a gain, but that's where we've had it set for all the tests. And you can see our noise level is not greater than minus 90 dBV or so, and that's with the A weighting applied per the spec. And as best I can tell, the noise level should be between 80 and 88 dBV. Here is a plot showing the isolation between the two inputs. In this case, I have a signal applied to the radio input, and that trace is shown right here. It's about minus 5. And then I have selected the auxiliary input, and those inputs are terminated into shorts. And so what you're looking at is the leakage from the radio inputs over to the auxiliary input. And at 1 kilohertz, we're at about minus 5 right here and about minus 60 here. So at least for the right channel, we've got about 55 dB of isolation. And if we come over here to the left channel at 1 kilohertz, it's probably about 10 dB better, so maybe 65 dB of isolation. So that's kind of the way it's looking. So the worst case isolation is at the high end of the frequency band, and it's still better than, I would say, about 40 dB, we'll say. This graph shows the effects of some of the different filters or tilt controls or bass lift controls, I guess it's called. And you can see you do get quite a bit of gain in the bass area, and it kind of moves the center frequency depending on which you choose. Also, I should point out this line here, this wide blue line in the center, that is with everything set flat. So that would be a reference point, and then you can gauge how much each of the different filters or tone controls affect the response. So right now I've got a 5 millivolt signal at 1 kilohertz applied to the phono input, or as Quad calls it, a disc input. We can see that it's actually got a very nice response. The THD is less than 0.002%. The SNR is in the 70 dB range, which is very good, and the THD plus noise is in the minus 70 dB range. So the phono or disc input looks really good. Now they do have a specification if A weighting is applied, and they say that the SNR should be about 75 dB, and we're at least 83, 84 dB. So this is meeting its phono stage requirements. However, I will point out that this 26 dB of gain is kind of low, but that's the gain of the phono stage plus the preamp, because the preamp by itself, where the volume control is set now, has actually about minus 4 dB or 5 dB of gain. This plot shows the frequency response of the disc or phono input with a 5 millivolt signal applied from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Now, there is a specification that it should be plus or minus a half a dB over that range. Well, actually, it's at 30 hertz, so this would be the 30 hertz line. So we are within a half a dB here. Now at the high end of the band, because of all this noise that we're getting, it's maybe almost a dB here for the right channel, and the left channel it's not quite a dB, but it's not quite meeting it. Plus it does have all this noise here. I'm not sure how audible that is on the phono stage. I don't typically listen to the phono stage of things that I test, but I do need to bring out the fact that I had to drop the volume controls gain. It went from about 27 dB, which you saw of the phono input stage, and that's at 1 kilohertz. And in order to not have some ringing here, I had to drop the gain down to 19 dB. So I had to lose about 7 dB of gain. Now this is measured at the preamp output. It is not the tape monitor output, because they do not have a tape monitor output. So it was just measured at the preamp output. So it does affect the amount of gain out of the phono stage. As you saw from the test data, this particular Quad 34 preamplifier did a pretty good job of meeting its specifications. Now, the one caveat about this preamplifier is that it doesn't have a lot of output voltage capability, maybe about 600 millivolts or so. And you get a loss out of the preamplifier at the maximum volume, at least before distortion creeps in, which is about minus 4.5 dB of loss going through this. Normally, most preamplifiers that I have measured, or integrated amplifiers when I'm measuring the preamp section, you don't have any problem getting 0 dB of gain through the preamplifier stage. And I usually test to see how much I can get out of the preamplifier before we start getting distortion. This guy actually has a loss, and it is what it is. And what that means is that if you have inefficient speakers and you have a power amp maybe that's marginal for those speakers, when you go to raise up the volume of this, you're only going to be able to get so far before you reach the limits of this, which is going to limit how much signal is going into your power amplifier. For most people, that may not be a problem, but indeed it is a weakness of this particular preamplifier, in addition to having DIN jacks. On the bright side, I will give Quad many kudos for labeling their solder side of the circuit board with the component identifications. That makes it so easy to track what's going on when you're trying to repair something, as was going on with this particular unit. So kudos to them for that. It's basically a very simple unit to operate. It does not have a tape monitor circuit, although it does have a tape input. With all that being said, how does it sound? Well, I connected it to my Bryson 2B-LP power amplifier, which delivers 60 watts into 8 ohms. The speakers I was using are my KEF 107 reference speakers, and they're a bit less efficient than my standard Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 loudspeakers. And this guy was able to get up to 86, 87 dB SPLs with that amplifier preamplifier combo. So it was plenty loud, but I'm not going to be shaking the walls and wondering if a mirror is going to fall off or a picture is going to fall off the wall. That's not going to happen with this. I also did like the bass lift, they call it, the bass boost, and went up to 3 dB. That was plenty for the bass. And it sounded really good. It's a very clean sounding preamplifier. As far as sonically, I have really no complaints with it. The sound, it just did a really good job. Now the tilt, the treble kind of adjustment, that did very little either way, and you kind of saw that within the data. So, basically it's a nice preamp. It's cute, it's simple to use, and if that's kind of your thing and you have the matching amp, which the owner of this does have the matching amp, maybe there'll be a review on that sometime. I'm sure it fits nicely with it, and hopefully it has in the 32, 33 dB of gain to make up for what this guy lacks in gain. So that being said, if you're in the market for something kind of vintage like this, it is a neat little piece, I will say that, and it sounds good. So if you haven't subscribe to the channel, that would be a good thing to do to help the channel grow. If you like the video, as always, hit the thumbs up, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the description below, and I do reply to just about all of them unless it's something where I can't read. Sometimes I get a comment in a language that Google Translate doesn't know what they're saying, so I can't really help it. Usually I'm very good about replying back. So I thank you for watching, and until next time, have a great day or night.